Radio Fènix, un podcast de debat, reflexió i lluita des del País Valencià.
Volem un món millor. Volem canviar el que tenim, però per a transformar la realitat, primer l'hem de comprendre. En l'episodi d'avui portem dues persones que pensen a fons la nostra realitat per a plantejar idees entorn de quin és el món que habitem i com el podem transformar. Aquest episodi és la ponència realitzada a València en el marc de la III Escola de Primavera organitzada per la Fènix Universitat Popular junt al Seminari de Filosofia, Economia i Política de la Universitat de València. En aquesta comptem amb dues veus de referència en la teoria crítica contemporània. Iker Jauregui és professor substitut en la Facultat de Filosofia de la Universitat Complutense de Madrid, especialitzat en formes socials del capitalisme partint de Karl Marx, la filosofia social i la teoria política. En la seva intervenció aborda la separació en el mode de producció capitalista i ens ofereix una mirada crítica envers la utopia. SØREN MAU és filòsof comunista danès i autor de l'obra La coacció muda, una teoria marxista del poder econòmic del capital. Mau analitza com les relacions capitalistes imposen dependència i subordinació a la classe treballadora, i en aquest episodi desplega una defensa materialista del pensament utòpic. Les reflexions i aportacions que escoltareu avui són fonamentals per enfortir la nostra lluita i construir una força capaç de disputar el poder al capital. En un moment de crisi sistèmica, on les contradiccions del capital es fan cada vegada més evidents, no hi ha prou amb quedar-nos en la crítica. Cal imaginar el futur que vindrà i organitzar-nos per a fer-lo possible. Per això, aquest episodi serveix per convidar-vos a la nostra quinta escola d'estiu que tindrà lloc a Xàtiva del 4 al 6 de setembre sota el títol El desig d'un nou món.
Voy a hablar del concepto marxista de separación. Separación como concepto es importante por varias razones. En primer lugar, el concepto de separación es importante porque hace referencia en la obra de Marx y en la tradición marxista a múltiples procesos sociales del modo de producción capitalista. En primer lugar, hace referencia a la separación, dice Marx, Trennung o divorcio, Scheidung, del proletario y los medios de producción y de subsistencia, es decir, la separación entendida como desposesión. Separación es un concepto que hace también o puede hacer también referencia en un sentido marxista a la separación entre lo económico y lo político, si se entiende por económico una función social automática e independiente de lo político, es decir, independiente de un poder no automático, sino dirigido o artificial. Separación, en un sentido marxista, puede hacer también referencia a la separación entre la llamada esfera reproductiva y la llamada esfera productiva. Si se entiende por reproducción el conjunto de tareas, digámoslo así, no validadas socialmente. Pero separación, en un sentido marxista, puede hacer referencia también a la separación o división del trabajo en un proceso laboral. Se puede separar o dividir este proceso laboral pues, por su naturaleza manual o intelectual, por los sectores a los que hace referencia o por las líneas de trabajo a las que hace referencia. Es que hay más sentidos aún de la separación en sentido marxista, como pueden ser la separación entre campo y ciudad, básicamente, y sobre todo en las últimas 2 décadas, pues la separación o ruptura metabólica entre humanidad y naturaleza. Digamos que si se entienden todas estas separaciones en conjunto, el capitalismo puede entenderse como un sistema de separaciones. Formales, no formales, espaciales, temporales. Este es el primer motivo por el que el concepto de separación es importante, porque describe o hace referencia a todos estos procesos históricos y sociales. Hay un segundo motivo por el que el concepto de separación es importante, al menos en la tradición marxista, y es que la idea de separación en todas estas representaciones que acabo de mencionar hace referencia a determinado desarrollo histórico, pero también a una lógica. Toda separación, de hecho, es un desarrollo histórico convertido en sistema. Dicho de otra forma, toda separación, todas las separaciones que he mencionado fueron causaron algo, pero de hecho, toda separación sigue siendo causa, no deja de ser causa y por tanto también es efecto. Esta sincronía, entre comillas, entre historia y lógica es importante porque permite precisamente entender el capitalismo de manera sincrónica. Es decir, y esto es lo importante, permite entender el capitalismo o identificar, digámoslo así, una contingencia en el capitalismo, pero también una necesidad. O dicho de otra forma, esta sincronía en torno al concepto de separación entre desarrollo histórico y sistema o lógica permite identificar contingencias y necesidades del capital. El capitalismo, dicho de otra forma, como toda otra forma de reproducción social, es un conjunto de presupuestos históricos convertidos en sistema. De hecho, la crítica de la economía política se puede entender así, una crítica de una serie de presupuestos históricos que se han convertido en sistema. Este es el segundo motivo por el que el concepto de separación yo creo que es importante. Pero hay un tercer motivo, que es que separación, la idea misma de separación, el concepto mismo de separación, presupone, obviamente, siempre una unión, ¿no? Solo se separa aquello que estaba unido. Esta idea, ¿no?, de que todo lo que es separado digamos, separado respecto a una unión previa, o que el concepto de separación incluye la idea de unión, es importante o útil para pensar qué es el capitalismo respecto a otras formas de reproducción social previas, ¿no? Si la separación implica una unión y el capitalismo es un sistema de separaciones, es interesante o útil pensar así las cosas y entender que la forma de reproducción social previa al capitalismo era una forma de producción social no separada. Esto por un lado. Pero es que además es útil porque nos permite pensar, digámoslo así, qué es el capitalismo, ya no solo en relación a formas de reproducción social previas, sino en relación con la forma de reproducción social que queremos o esperamos que le suceda, es decir, el comunismo. Se puede decir, si el capitalismo, frente a otros modos de producción previos, por ejemplo, el feudalismo, es la separación de lo que estaba unido, el comunismo, frente al capitalismo, será necesariamente la reunión de lo que estaba separado. Todo esto, pero especialmente este último punto, yo creo que explica como el éxito o la utilidad del concepto de separación, ¿no?, que permite sobre todo pensar qué vino antes y qué vendrá después. Pues bien, hay un riesgo, a mi juicio, en simplificar las cosas hasta este punto. Y este riesgo es tanto teórico como político. Yo quería aprovechar esta jornada de hoy para problematizar este riesgo de simplificar las cosas hasta este punto, que desde ya podemos llamar el riesgo, entre comillas, el riesgo utopista de la reunificación o de la reunión, se entiende, de lo que estaba separado. El riesgo utopista de la reunificación. Pues bien, volvamos a las separaciones que mencionaba antes. Con Marx, la separación fundamental del sistema capitalista es la separación del trabajador respecto de los medios de producción y de reproducción. Es decir, aquí la separación entendida como desposesión, básicamente. El proceso histórico al que remite esta separación, la separación como desposesión, es bien conocido, obviamente. En el caso de Inglaterra, que es el caso al que Marx dedica un capítulo entero en El Capital, la historia de esta separación, esto es importante, es una historia violenta y externa. Violenta y externa. Es la historia de la expropiación generalizada de tierras, de los cercamientos, de los desahucios masivos y de la muerte por inanición de miles de campesinos en el campo inglés en torno a 1500. En Francia, por ejemplo, la historia de esta separación es la historia de un proyecto político, el del fin del régimen de señorazgo feudal y la posterior creación de un Estado y un mercado nacional unificados. Me refiero al periodo de la restauración napoleónica en torno a 1800. Pero es que en Galicia, que es donde yo nací y crecí, la historia de esta separación no es exactamente o no solo una historia violenta y externa, es una historia lenta y muy tardía. Es la historia de la progresiva pérdida de economías rurales de subsistencia, de su progresiva complementación con la venta de productos básicos en el mercado y, en definitiva, del éxodo rural de la posguerra en torno a 1950, que es algo que estoy seguro que aquí al 90% les suena. La pregunta es, antes de estas separaciones, ¿qué pasaba, ¿no? En la Inglaterra de 1400, en la Francia de 1700, en la Galicia del 1900. Pues bien, la relación, esto es simplificar mucho, la relación entre el trabajador y los medios de producción y de subsistencia no era una relación separada, era una relación basada en la unidad o en la unión. Esta unión o esta unidad se basaba, como también es sabido, en la propiedad de la tierra y de los instrumentos de labranza en las economías agrícolas, ¿no? En la propiedad también de los frutos o los productos del trabajo, de los que solo una parte era obligatorio entregar al señor feudal del que se dependía jurídicamente. La unión, ¿no?, feudal basada en esta propiedad de los medios de producción y reproducción, ¿no?, la unión feudal hacía innecesario el dinero y el mercado de forma generalizada. Por tanto, o por contraste, la separación capitalista hace necesario el dinero y el mercado de forma generalizada. Como escribe Marx, y aquí parafraseo, la separación capitalista originaria es el presupuesto último de las relaciones sociales capitalistas. Sin separación, tal y como la estamos definiendo, no es necesaria la venta de fuerza de trabajo. Sin separación, el mercado no se convierte en un paso obligado, es decir, en un imperativo. Sin separación no hay, dice Marx, en resumen, relación de capital. Esta separación, a la que Marx llama también separación de las condiciones objetivas del trabajo, es el presupuesto histórico último, dice literalmente Marx, del modo de producción capitalista. Ahora bien, un modo de producción no es solo un presupuesto, por muy último que sea. Tampoco es un modo de producción varios presupuestos. Un modo de producción es también todo aquello que los presupuestos habilitan. No solo un presupuesto, ni varios presupuestos, sino todo lo que los presupuestos habilitan. Es, por tanto, también un modo de producción ese dinero y ese mercado que se vuelven no solo pasos necesarios para reunirse con los medios de subsistencia de los que se está separado, sino que se convierten también en modos, modelos o formatos, formas de socialización, es decir, pegamentos sociales, formas de regular o reunir precisamente las relaciones entre cosas y entre personas. Un modo de producción, además del presupuesto último que es la separación, es también la relación de capital misma, es decir, la constitución del obrero en tanto que obrero, es decir, en tanto que vendedor de fuerza de trabajo, y la constitución del capitalista en tanto que capitalista, es decir, de comprador de fuerza de trabajo. Dicho de otra forma, el capitalismo, en tanto que modo de producción, es también cierta unidad o unión posibilitada por aquella separación. Dicho de otra forma, la separación es solo una cara, expresa una parte, que es la parte del origen histórico, la de la causa última, la de la ruptura. Separación, si se quiere, es una categoría epistemológica. Es decir, la idea de separación no se puede entender aislada. Todo lo que el capitalismo disuelve, así habla Marx, dice todo el rato disolución, disolver, todo lo que el capitalismo disuelve es inmediatamente reunificado, reunificado. En esto, y no en otra cosa, consiste precisamente la categoría de subsunción. ¿Qué es la subsunción? El proceso por el cual, a través de diversos mecanismos de internalización, subordinación y dominación, el capital da forma a prácticas materiales y relaciones sociales previamente no unificadas o no formadas por el capital. La separación crea un espacio cuya conexión pasa a estar mediada o subsumida bajo el capital. La historia de la separación de los medios de producción y de reproducción, que es a la que me estoy refiriendo, es la historia, cito a Marx, de una potencia, de una potencialidad. El acto que resulta de esta potencia, podemos decir, es una nueva unidad social, una nueva unidad social. Marx es muy claro sobre esto que estoy diciendo, es decir, sobre esta idea de que el capitalismo es un proceso de separación y unificación cuando habla del dinero. Cuando habla del dinero. El dinero, así lo define Marx, es, por un lado, comunidad, Gemeinwesen, universal, y, a la vez, dice Marx, disolvente universal. El dinero une, por eso es una comunidad universal, y disuelve, por eso es un disolvente. Une y separa. O, como dicen los manuscritos de París, cito literalmente, si el dinero es el vínculo que me une a la vida, que une a la sociedad, que me une con la naturaleza y con el ser humano, ¿no es el dinero el vínculo de todos los vínculos? ¿No puede el dinero atar y desatar todas las ataduras? ¿No es también por esto mismo el medio o agente universal de la separación? Se pregunta Marx. Fin de la cita. Yo creo que el Capital, el libro El Capital, se puede entender desde aquí, ¿no? Por cada crítica de la separación, es decir, por cada crítica de las formas sociales separadas, Marx ofrece inmediatamente después una crítica de la unidad, es decir, de la unidad que resulta de esta separación. Por cada crítica de la forma social separada, Marx ofrece una crítica de la forma social unificada que resulta de esta separación. Por ejemplo, en la manufactura, y aquí empiezo a citar a Marx, dice Marx, el capital separa y divide el proceso laboral en diversas operaciones parciales, que luego son combinadas y reconectadas bajo el comando, de un capitalista individual. Otro ejemplo, la relación separada entre el trabajo y sus condiciones objetivas es, dice Marx, reconstruida en cada proceso laboral en base, cito, a su nueva unidad normal. El modo de producción capitalista, como cualquier otro modo de producción, y esto es importante, como cualquier otro modo de producción, solo se puede leer así, como un enorme proceso de disolución y reunificación, es decir, un enorme proceso de separación y unidad. Separación, como idea, como concepto, es evidente que remite, además de todo lo que acabo de decir, a una categoría espacial. No solo, digamos, se separa algo que está unido, sino que separación hace referencia a una separación que se da en el espacio. Los dos términos separados no solo lo están, por tanto, formalmente, sino espacialmente también. Esto aplica al resto de separaciones capitalistas que, más allá de Marx, la teoría marxista ha analizado. Pensemos, por ejemplo, en primer lugar, en la separación que he mencionado al principio entre lo económico y lo político. ¿A qué refiere esta separación? Refiere a la formación paralela, y esto es importante, de un poder público centralizado que monopoliza mediante el monopolio de la fuerza y de la violencia, el poder político, es decir, el Estado. Y, por contra, refiere también, cuando hablamos de lo económico separado de lo político, a un poder privado descentralizado que monopoliza, entre comillas, mediante su propia autorregulación y sus propios automatismos, el discurrir económico, es decir, el mercado. Ambas formas de regulación, la política y la económica, o si queréis ambas formas de poder, el poder político y el poder económico, se definen recíprocamente como esferas independientes. La del Estado, por un lado, definido como una esfera no económica, sino solo política, y la de la economía o la del mercado, al revés, como una esfera no política, sino solo económica. Esta separación tiene, como toda separación, una historia, ¿no? Igual que vimos que la separación como desposesión tenía una historia, esta separación tiene su propia historia. ¿Cuál es esta historia? Pues la de, digámoslo así, la de la formación del Estado burgués, que unifica la disgregación jurídica y administrativa feudal, cohesiona a las clases dirigentes en torno a un interés común, no inmediatamente económico. ¿Por qué? Porque lo económico ahora tiene lugar fuera precisamente del Estado. Y en paralelo, esta historia es la historia de la formación de un mercado de mercancías y de trabajo, sobre todo a nivel nacional, también unificado y que funciona más o menos autónomamente. Por ello mismo, la historia de esta separación tiene también distintas temporalidades. O dicho de otra forma, por eso el primer teórico del Estado moderno, Thomas Hobbes, concibe en la Inglaterra de 1650 el Estado como policía y como burocracia que, a cambio de paz, niega toda libertad social excepto una, la de comprar y vender. ¿Por qué? Porque la economía, ya en la Inglaterra de 1650, no necesita a la política. Esto explica igualmente que el primer teórico de la sociedad civil moderna, Hegel, concibiera en la Prusia de 1820 a la sociedad civil, que Hegel define como el reino de las necesidades satisfechas por medio de la división del trabajo y la propiedad privada, concibe esta sociedad civil precisamente como separada e incluso posterior al Estado. Es decir, la sociedad civil no es como tal una sociedad política, sino solo económica. Están separadas. Otro ejemplo más del carácter espacial de las separaciones o de la idea de separación es la separación entre lo productivo y lo reproductivo. Obviamente, esta separación también tiene una historia que se expresa también en términos espaciales. En este caso, esta separación hace referencia a la progresiva diferenciación espacial entre hogar reproductivo y espacio productivo o trabajo. Es decir, hace referencia a la progresiva expulsión fuera del hogar, de diferentes procesos que antes estaban integrados. Se puede decir que esta diferenciación o separación es, digámoslo así, híbrida o parcial en modelos productivos como la industria a domicilio o la pequeña producción de mercancías o la industria rural de la Europa en transición, digamos así, del feudalismo al capitalismo hasta aproximadamente el siglo XIX. Y que esta separación es total, esta separación espacial entre el hogar reproductivo y el trabajo productivo es total, empieza a ser total ya entrado el siglo XX. El modelo más representativo de esta forma de separación espacial entre lo productivo y lo reproductivo es la forma social fordista, sobre todo en Estados Unidos. Y es la más representativa precisamente por aquello que hace relevante esta separación, que es que, digámoslo así, la espacialización separada entre lo productivo y lo reproductivo se escribe y se reasigna en términos de género, es decir, una esfera o un espacio para los sujetos leídos como hombres y otra esfera o otro espacio para los sujetos leídos como mujeres. Es evidente el carácter espacial de esta separación también. Y yo creo que Por lo mismo, no hace falta detenerse mucho en otras separaciones que he mencionado, que son igualmente espaciales o representables espacialmente, como la separación entre campo y ciudad, o entre humanidad y naturaleza. Pues bien, la pregunta que creo que cabe hacerse respecto a todo lo anterior es: ¿están realmente separados, aunque lo estén espacialmente, el Estado y el mercado? ¿O están realmente separados, aunque lo estén espacialmente, el hogar y el trabajo? Evidentemente, no. Tampoco lo están el campo y la ciudad, tampoco lo están la humanidad y la naturaleza. Ambas dualidades, Estado, mercado, hogar, trabajo, campo, ciudad, humanidad, naturaleza, estas dualidades están evidentemente separadas, pero también están evidentemente unidas. Están evidentemente unidas. De hecho, su separación misma se puede plantear incluso como la forma de su unidad última. El capitalismo es, desde lo que estoy intentando como transmitir, es un modo de producción que separa y une. Más aún, un modo de producción, cualquier modo de producción, es una forma específica de separar y unir. En el feudalismo, a la separación, al particular modo feudal de separar, se le llamó, por un lado, propiedad de la tierra y, por otro lado, señor. Y a la forma de unir estas separaciones se le llamó poder político. O, dicho de otra forma, por si a alguien les resulta más claro, la no separación feudal con los medios de producción y de reproducción fue el reverso de la separación jurídica entre siervo y señor. En el capitalismo, la separación se llama mercancía, fuerza de trabajo, y se llama también Estado. Se puede llamar también hogar y se puede llamar también trabajo. Y lo que une todas estas cosas lo llamamos capital. Dicho de otra forma un poco más abstracta y provocadoramente, lo contrario de una separación no es una unión, sino otra separación. La relación entre separación y unión o unidad no es de contrarios. Es, si se quiere, de nuevo, una diferencia, una relación epistemológica. Toda separación es, a la vez, según cómo se mire, una unión. Así, por ejemplo, toda división o separación del trabajo incluye ya una nueva forma de socializar el trabajo. De la misma forma, un mercado de mercancías separadas, como el nuestro, es ya una nueva forma de unir mercancías. Más radical aún, la desposesión, es decir, la separación con los medios de producción y reproducción, implica ya, repito, la desposesión implica ya una nueva forma de poseer lo que no se posee. La creación de una esfera económica y otra política es ya una nueva forma de gestionar precisamente políticamente lo económico y económicamente lo político. Lo mismo con la separación entre lo productivo y lo reproductivo, que es ya una nueva forma de unir lo productivo con lo reproductivo, etcétera, etcétera. Esto es lo que digo que es en el fondo la crítica de la economía política, ¿no? Una teoría crítica de las separaciones y uniones del capital. Con esto termino. Creo, y esto es, digámoslo así, todo lo que quería decir es esto, que creo que hay un riesgo en el análisis unilateral del capitalismo como un sistema de separaciones. Creo que hay un riesgo en analizar unilateralmente así el capitalismo, es decir, de entender que una separación no es necesariamente correlativa a una unión que le corresponde, sino que es solo una separación, ¿no? Un riesgo en el análisis, ya digo, unilateral del capitalismo como sistema de separaciones. Y este riesgo aparece cuando se analiza lo que vino antes y lo que vendrá después del capitalismo como sistema de separaciones. Es decir, cuando, a diferencia de la sociedad separada capitalista, las sociedades de antes y sobre todo las sociedades que vendrán se analizan como sociedades no separadas, sino unificadas, o sociedades unidas, basadas en la unidad, en la unión. Es decir, creo que hay un riesgo cuando se analizan las sociedades previas al capitalismo y posteriores al capitalismo como sociedades pre-post separadas. Este riesgo se llama nostalgia. Este riesgo se llama reunión de lo separado. Este riesgo se llama reunión de lo que estaba disuelto. Se llama reconciliación final de lo que estaba separado. Además, creo que es posible leer una parte de la historia del movimiento obrero desde este mismo marco simplista o peligroso. De hecho, esta idea ha sido, volviendo aquí a Marx, uno de los hilos que unía, digámoslo así, al socialismo utópico en el siglo XIX. Esto es un hilo conductor del socialismo utópico del XIX. Dicho más claramente, el comunismo no puede ser una reunificación, una reunión. El comunismo será un proceso social de uniones y separaciones libres, justas e iguales. Pero no puede ser solo una unión. La forma, digámoslo así, específica de unir lo separado en el capitalismo se llama capital. Pero es que la forma específica de unir lo separado en el comunismo no sabemos cómo se llama, porque no sabemos cómo estará unido lo unido y cómo estará separado lo separado. Dicho de otra forma, conocemos las condiciones, pero no conocemos ni podemos conocer los resultados de las condiciones. Y ya termino. No creo, obviamente, que la imaginación utópica o la utopía o el pensamiento utópico sea un enemigo del marxismo. Yo no creo eso. Pero creo que expresa un riesgo al que me he referido y que he llamado como riesgo utopista en la utopía, ¿no? Creo que expresa ese riesgo y a la vez quizás expresa un síntoma. Decía Gramsci que el determinismo y el finalismo, la teleología finalista de algunos marxistas de la Segunda Internacional, eran síntomas de su contexto de derrota. Quizás nuestro particular síntoma de nuestra particular derrota sea nuestro particular finalismo utópico. Gracias.
Typical anti-utopian attitude in the Marxist tradition and more broadly on the left. So I want to present some thoughts on the usefulness, the political usefulness of utopian thinking. And when I'm speaking of utopian thinking here, I'm speaking of relatively concrete descriptions of what a better and possible future could look like. That's the kind of utopian visions I'm interested in. So that means that it doesn't really count as a utopian vision to just say a classless society and not specify more what that means. I'm interested in thinking about the utility of coming up with concrete description of what it would mean to have a society without classes, for example. And historically, the left, and especially the socialist and Marxist traditions on the left have been very skeptical of utopianism, of utopian thinking. And some people would maybe also say that the world we live in today gives us a number of good reasons to be skeptical of utopian thinking, because most progressive struggles today take the form of struggles against something, right? Against climate catastrophe, against fascism, against genocide, against racism and sexism, against war, and so on. So I think that's true, that most progressive struggles today are struggles against something, first of all, defined as negative struggles in that way. So one could maybe say, you know, how relevant is it in this world today to spend time discussing what we would do if we won the struggle against all of these forces of reaction? Shouldn't we be more concerned with analyzing the contemporary world and figure out how to fight the reactionary forces? But I think there's actually some good reasons why it's an important part of that struggle to think more concretely about what we want to replace the current world with. So I think utopian thinking actually has a potential today, and I want to try to present an argument for that. So first, what I want to do now is to try to reconstruct what I take to be the essential arguments against utopian thinking in the Marxist tradition. I think this anti-utopian attitude can be reconstructed as three different arguments that each of them are sufficient to reject utopianism. I think all three of these arguments can be found in Marx's writings, if more or less explicitly, and have been developed by later Marxist thinkers. The first typical critique of utopian thinking in the Marxist tradition is a historical argument about what drives historical change, how history changes, what drives processes of social political change. And it's an argument that's based on what I would take to be the most essential insight in any materialist conception of history, which is that ideas do not change the world, right? It's not the introduction of new ideas that lead to large-scale historical change. Because of that, utopian thinking is simply an ineffective political tool. So therefore it doesn't really make sense to spend a lot of time on doing that. That's one argument that I think can be clearly found in a lot of Marxist writers. So that's the first argument. It's an argument based on a theory of history, right? A historical argument in that sense. Historical philosophical argument. A second argument against utopianism that we find in the Marxist tradition is an argument, it's a sort of epistemological argument. It's an argument about how human thought works and the limits of human thought. It's an argument that the conclusion to this argument is that utopianism is strictly speaking impossible, because human thinking is always so much shaped by the historical situation we find ourselves in that it's basically impossible to think beyond the world we live in now, right? So our ideas about a world after capitalism, how that would look like, would inevitably just be a negative reflection of the world that we live in. We can't even really think the radically new, because the concepts we would use to describe such a situation is so much influenced by the world we live in. So we would just project a negative vision of the present into the future. So it's really impossible to think the radically new. That was the second argument. The third argument I think we often find against utopianism on the left is a political argument. It's an argument that would claim that, or conclude that, utopian thinking is undesirable. Even if it was possible, even if it was useful, it would be undesirable, because it contradicts a central political value or principle on the left, which is what the Marxist Hal Draper has called the principle of self-emancipation, which is the idea that the emancipation of the proletariat has to be the work of the proletariat itself. So this way of thinking would then claim that utopianism presupposes a division of labor between intellectuals designing the plans for the future and the masses carrying out those plans. And that contradicts this idea that it should be up to whoever is starting and doing the revolution to figure out what to replace capitalism with. So what should we think about these three arguments? I think that they are both true and false at the same time, in a way. And by that I mean that I think there is some truth in all of these arguments, but we don't have to accept them in their strongest version. I think it's possible to acknowledge that these arguments tell us something important about the limits of utopian thinking, or the pitfalls of utopian thinking, and hold on to those insights while at the same time not accepting them in their strongest version. So I would propose to interpret them as warnings about bad forms of utopian thinking, but not as arguments that completely rule out that utopian thinking can actually be useful and possible and desirable. I'm not going to go too detailed into these arguments here because I don't have time for that. You can ask me about the more detailed arguments in this if you want to, but just very briefly, to the first argument, the historical argument, I would say yes, something like yes, historical change is not the result of new ideas being introduced, so ideas cannot be the starting point or the primary cause of a process of historical change, but I don't think a materialist theory of history should require us to completely deny that humans are thinking beings and that thinking is a part of acting, and that thinking can actually play a role in creating historical change, even or in processes of historical change, even if they can't be the starting point and the primary cause of it. So it does have a role to play, and I think that opens up a possibility of utopian thinking being at least a little bit useful. With regards to the argument about the historical determination of our thinking and the limitations of human thought, this is a bit more complicated, but I think it's important not to think of historical development as a succession of blocks that are neatly delineated where every part of a historical totality is an immediate reflection of that totality. So human history contains things on multiple time scales, and that means that when we transition from one mode of production to the other, it's not everything in this world that changes, right? There are aspects of the world that continue to be the same, the laws of nature, for example. The context that determines our thinking not only contains very historically specific things that has only existed in capitalism, but also lots of things from other historical periods and even transhistorical phenomenon. So that's for that reason, I don't think we can. I don't think we should accept a very strong historicism, even if we can accept this argument in a weaker version. With regards to the political argument that utopian thinking contradicts the principle of self-emancipation, my reply to that would be that it only does if we think of utopian visions as plans that are designed by individual thinkers disconnected from political movements and are then supposed to be carried out. If we instead think of utopian visions as parts of an ongoing discussion and conversation in social movements, and as developing toolboxes that can be combined in many different ways in concrete contexts, I don't think that it's necessary that utopian thinking contradicts the principle of self-emancipation. So my conclusion to this is these arguments, these classical arguments against utopian thinking, warn us about potential pitfalls and dangers of a bad form of utopian thinking, but they don't rule out that utopian thinking can actually be useful. So how useful then is utopian thinking? I think that depends a lot on the historical context, and I think one of the things that went wrong in a lot of the discussions in the 20th century about utopianism is that it was discussed as it was primarily a purely philosophical discussion. And I think that it's necessary to look at more concretely the historical context in order to find out how useful utopian thinking can be in any given historical context. So I want to switch to a more historical kind of argument now and try to make a quick historical comparison between the world we live in today and roughly the period between mid-19th century, when Marx started criticizing utopian socialists, and until the beginning of the neoliberal era in the 1970s. So that's about 120 years. I think that there are some significant aspects of this historical period that made utopianism less appealing and less necessary and less useful than it is today. So I think that there's some important insights to be gained from a historical comparison between these different eras. How much time do I have left? How much have I talked? Have I talked for about 10 minutes? 15 minutes maybe? Okay. I hope so. All right. I know it sounds like a huge thing to make such a historical comparison, but I'll try to just point to especially three aspects of that historical period between mid-19th century and the 1970s that I think are significant for this question and where our world today differs. So the first significant aspect of that period is the existence of an outside to capitalism. And by this, I mean, for example, pre-capitalist modes of production existing alongside capitalism. I mean, in the mid-19th century, when Marx wrote about capitalism, most of the world's population lived in non-capitalist modes of production, right? But it could also be post or non-capitalist modes of production existing alongside capitalism, such as the really existing socialism of the 20th century. But an outside to capitalism can also be, for example, remnants of pre-capitalist life forms that persist in capitalist society. So it's not just pre-capitalist modes of production alongside capitalism, or non-post-capitalist modes of production alongside capitalism. It's also pre-capitalist life forms continuing to have influence and be culturally passed on from generation to generation inside of capitalist society. So until quite recently, there was a substantial outside to capitalism in a sense, not in the sense that there was something that was unaffected by capitalism, but in the sense that many people had an idea about how life was before capitalism or how it could be under another system, right? It's a very, we no longer live in that situation. We have found ourselves as humanity in a very unique situation for only about 35 years, which is that for the first time in human history, almost all of humanity lives in one interconnected global system, right? And that's something that has only been like that for, since the early 1990s. So that's a very unique situation that we no longer really have a significant outside of capitalism. And the remnants of pre-capitalist life forms that persisted for a long time have always also to a large degree disappeared, right? Just because capitalism has existed for so long in so many places now. So there is no longer a living memory of pre-capitalist life forms, which there were in a lot of places 100 years ago. And my point here is that the existence of an outside to capitalism in these many different forms, we could call them external outsides and internal outsides, they acted as material supports for the belief that it's possible to live in a completely different way, right? Even if the outside represented something that was even worse than capitalism. Just the fact that people could see or knew from experience that capitalism is not the only game in town, acted as a material support for the belief that something else is possible, right? So that's one thing I think is significant about that historical context versus ours historical context. Another important thing, so this is the second important highlight here that I want to draw attention to, is the workers' movement, the existence of a strong and growing, powerful workers' movement. And here I rely a lot on the journal Endnotes and their brilliant analysis of the history of the workers' movement. So this Endnotes journal collective analyze or make a powerful argument about how we should not understand the workers' movement as the universal form of proletarian struggle against capital, but as a historically specific way in which the proletariat struggled against a certain form of capitalism that existed in a particular stage of the history of capitalism, right? And that we're no longer in that situation. And that's a significant part of the reason why the workers' movement have to a large degree disappeared and been undermined in the neoliberal era. So my argument here would be that the existence of a strong workers' movement made utopianism less necessary, because in its most successful periods, especially in Europe, the workers' movement created a sort of infrastructure of the socialist future that made it easy for people to imagine what socialism would look like. The workers' movement was not only unions and parties, but consisted of a lot of different organizations that basically organized the everyday lives of workers, like consumer cooperatives, housing, sports clubs, like entertainment, culture, newspapers, banks, and so on, that were controlled and organized by the workers' movement, so that many workers could have their entire lives organized in and through this movement. And that created a sort of infrastructure of the future that made it, as I said, made it much easier to imagine what socialism would mean, right? The party would take over the state, the unions would take over the workplaces, and the market would be replaced by central planning. And for that reason, the workers' movement presented implicitly a vision of socialism that made it less necessary to spend a lot of time discussing, what will the socialist future look like. It was a particular idea of socialism, of course, and well, the point is that today the workers' movement has collapsed, and I agree with endnotes and similar groups and thinkers who would emphasize that it's not possible to rebuild the workers' movement. It was built around the worker identity, of a pride around work, around a feeling that that the working class was building the future, building the world, doing something that would also be useful and necessary after capitalism was abolished. But today's world of work is not capable of underpinning such a vision, because what has happened in the last 50 years is that deindustrialization and lots of other, and also the industrialization of agricultural production has pushed workers out of these kinds of jobs that made it possible to organize around the worker identity, right? So a larger and larger share of the global proletariat are completely excluded from the sphere of production as relative surplus populations, right? Or they work in low-wage service sector jobs that do not really, that is not capable of representing something about the future in that sense, where workers don't feel that they're doing something meaningful that they would like to continue doing after a revolution. So today's world of work the way that capitalism has developed means that it's no longer possible to rebuild a movement like that. We have to figure out a new way to organize a revolutionary movement, and don't get stuck in ideas about organization and revolution that belongs to another stage of capitalist history. So that's the second important aspect that I want to highlight about that the historical context of anti-utopianism, right? The idea is that the arguments against utopianism had certain historical conditions and backgrounds that made them more persuasive and convincing. Finally, the third historical aspect I want to highlight is the climate crisis, which did not really play a role in most of the classical discussions about utopianism for good reasons. And I think the climate crisis is a hugely important context for the question of utopian thinking today. In a way, the climate crisis means that the climate crisis is a kind of material undermining of the distinction between utopia and dystopia. Because even if a revolution hadn't happened today and capitalism was abolished globally today, we would have to live with the consequences of fossil capitalism for a very long time. We would have to devote significant amount of resources for many, many, many years to repair this planet that we will inherit from capitalism, right? So for each day that fossil capitalism is allowed to keep on destroying the planet, the longer that continues, the more dystopian will our utopians' visions have to be, right? The more the distinction between utopia and dystopia will be blurred. But there's also a sense in which the climate crisis forces us all to be utopians, because it means that, well, given that capitalism is unable to reproduce its own natural foundation and therefore will necessarily continue to undermine its own natural conditions, radical change is going to happen. Whether it takes the form of capitalism undermining itself in an ecological breakdown, or some political force that manages to change the course of history. So the only completely unrealistic scenario is the continuation of status quo. And that's another significant aspect, I think, about our historical moment, and that I think makes utopian thinking more urgent and relevant and meaningful to engage in today. So what I'm trying to say here is that the anti-utopian attitude that is still, I would say, quite popular on the left, was connected to a certain historical moment that is no longer ours. That, in a way, what I'm saying is that the critique of utopianism was, to a large degree, true, but in a certain historical context that we are no longer in. Today, we find ourselves in a collective crisis of imagination, political imagination, and I think that utopian thinking can help us with that. In a certain sense, this is a pessimistic conclusion, because my argument is, in a way, that the forces of repression today are so strong that we have lost our capacity to, or that we're losing our capacity to think that it's possible to organize social life in another way than capitalism. So I think we need utopian thinking in order to strengthen the belief that another world is possible. That's one crucial function I think utopian thinking can have today. I'm not saying that it's the only way of doing that, or that it's the most important way of doing that. I'm just making the more modest argument that it can contribute to that. I think capitalism, ideologically speaking, capitalism's main ideological justification today is not so much the kind of passionate defenses of it that we find in neoliberal thinkers like Friedman or Hayek, who would describe capitalism as a harmonious system of freedom where we could all live good lives, right? This kind of this depiction of capitalism, I think, does not really resonate with a lot of people today, right? War and climate crisis and everything. I think everyone basically has a sense that the world is collapsing in a way now, and so so these passionate defenses of capitalism that we were used to in the past, it does not seem so convincing anymore. So I think, in a way, the primary ideological justification for capitalism today is simply the absence of a belief that it's possible to do something else. So that's where I think utopian thinking can be helpful. So another function utopianism can have that I think have been underestimated in the Marxist tradition is the emotional impact it can have on people. That's definitely an impact it has on me. Discussing very concretely what a communist future could look like is something that, for me personally, does not draw my attention away from the struggles that are going on, but rather something that actually gives me energy and makes me want to engage in those struggles. So that's another thing. I'm trying to list like different positive things that utopian thinking can do. So I think I also think that utopian thinking will actually be useful when the day comes that we're going to have to build something else, whether it's in the form of a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, or it's the form of some kind of chaotic breakdown where capitalism will undermine itself. In those situations, I think it will be useful to have lots of utopian visions for the future. Not in the sense that I think that we're going to have a kind of vote where we will take individual utopian visions and then vote on which one of them to actualize and then do that, but more in the sense that I think we need thousands of utopian visions that we can draw on as toolboxes that we can adapt and combine according to the concrete situation we find ourselves in. So that's why I think that we should maybe spend a bit more time today talking about what the future that we want should look like. Thank you. I have 2 questions for Iker. As I said, I think I agreed with everything you said. I think, at least, insofar as I understood it correctly. So maybe this is a question about whether or not I did understand it correctly. And I'm specifically thinking of the last part of your talk where you said that this way of thinking about separation and unity is also a kind of critique of a certain form of utopianism, or utopianism as such. I think that's maybe what I want to ask you. Because I actually think that the way you think about separation and unity presents an argument for a certain kind of utopianism, and that's because I think that if we accepted the romantic idea, the romantic critique of capitalism, and thought of capitalism as a separation that should be overcome so that we could reunify what had been separated. I mean, if we had this idea that there's a kind of political unity that can be re-established, an order that will spontaneously emerge if we just abolish capitalism, then there would be no need for utopian thinking, right? Because then it would just be a matter of getting rid of capitalism and then let, I don't know, human nature or whatever evolve spontaneously. So I think it's precisely because it's precisely because it's not like that, because that's not true, because there is no natural order, no spontaneous unity that will emerge, that we need to think about what we want to replace capitalism with. So that was my first question. The second one is more simple. Do you want me to ask the second one now? Okay. So this, I think it's a great list of separation that you present, the separations between humanity and nature, the worker and the means of production, political, economic, production, reproduction, and so on. So I was wondering, is that an exhaustive list of separations for you? Are those the separations that define capitalism? And the reason I'm asking is that there's specifically one aspect of capitalism that I would probably also describe as a separation that is constitutive of capitalism, and so it's an essential feature of capitalism, and that's the separation between the waged and the unwaged, or not, because that makes it sound like production and reproduction, which you already described. What I'm thinking about here is the relative surplus population. Capitalism cannot exist without a certain amount of people who are unemployed, right? Without ejecting people from the labor market, but not ejecting them completely, still keeping them as potential wage laborers that can be hired. So that way of regulating wages and putting pressures on worker, that's an essential power mechanism, a mechanism of the power of capital, I would say. So that separation between the relative surplus population and wage laborers, would you maybe it doesn't, I don't know, count as separation, or would you be open to adding that to the list?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I think they are so good. That's my answer.
All right, thanks. Wonderful.
I think I would answer first the last one, as it has to do only with like separation, and then we go to utopian thinking. I would say every time I'm thinking about separations, I think that there's two kinds. Like the group, you can divide it in two. And I think the important ones, the fundamental ones, are the ones that we can think about as if they are necessary for capitalism. So that does not resolve the question, but maybe only postpones it. For example, what do we think of the separation between reproduction and production? So that postpones the debate, because you could have to deal with the fact that that separation is, regarding some authors, not necessary, blah, blah, blah. In my view, I would say the only necessary fundamental ones are the separation with the means of production and reproduction, and the separation between the economic and the politicals, because they are the same. And your book, for example, is a way of explaining why they are the same. Because what enables a power which is only economic and not political is the separation from the means of production and reproduction. Without the separation with the means of production and reproduction, that would not be as a possibility, a power which is only, or that presents itself only in economic terms. But I think this, like the existence of a surplus population, it's true that it like falls under what I'm saying in the best of the senses. It's like absolutely necessary, not only now, but since its beginning. It's an almost, a logic, not like a necessary logic of the system since its beginning. So I think it's a nice adding to it. But I think it's like the importance of separation has to do with its necessary appearance. And regarding my critique of utopian thinking, I think, to be honest, my critique is a critique of the history of utopian thinking. But it's what makes utopia a concept is its history of utopian thinking. So the point is, I think the history of utopian thought don't look, these utopian thinkers, they are not looking to the future, but they are always looking towards the past. They think they look towards the future, but they cannot do that. They are always looking towards the past. That's my critique of utopian thought, not to utopia or utopian thinking now or nowadays itself. The problem is there a way of thinking something like utopia breaking with utopian thought, or with that historical classic utopian thought? Is there a way of thinking about utopia not thinking about the past? Or, for example, why do you need to call it utopia? Isn't it because you want to belong to a history of thought? I am asking, you know what I mean? I think utopia and utopianism is like a bit intoxicated with this looking, trying to look to the future, but only looking to the past. I would leave it here. I have a question regarding your, I can do it now, or you want me to do it now?
Well, I can also maybe just quickly answer that question that you just gave me, even though I'm not really sure what to say. I think a part of the reason why I call what I want to do myself and want others to do also, why I call that utopianism or utopian thinking, is maybe just an acknowledgement, and that's what people are going to call it. Even if I try to call it something else, that's But also, I actually also think that there is a tendency in Marxism to be too dismissive of the utopian tradition. And not only, I think that, I mean, in general, I think Marx's critique of utopian socialism is very convincing. But I think sometimes it's kind of forgotten how much it was a debate between different socialist projects in very concrete context that Marx was criticizing those specific political movements. And I think a lot of what he criticized about them was not so much that they were utopian, but just the way that they thought about political change and things like that. Yeah, and sometimes I think it's often forgotten that, or often later Marxists have turned this critique that was embedded in a specific historical context into more universal philosophical arguments. But I also think there's a value in even older pre-capitalist utopian thinking like Thomas More. And so yeah, I think I don't mind thinking about what I do as a part of that tradition, and I think it's possible to be a part of a tradition like that and still be very critical of parts of in the same way as there's a lot of the Marxist intellectual legacy that I like, technological determinism and many other things that I think is incredibly wrong, but I still regard myself as a Marxist. And I don't know, maybe it's relevant just to add here something that I should maybe have said in my talk that I forgot, which is that these thoughts about utopian thinking is a part of a book project that I'm working on, where I'm trying to write a book that is a utopian vision of a communist future, and this is kind of the justification for doing that, or it's probably going to be the first chapter if I manage to finish that book, where I'm going to try to defend what I'm doing in the rest of the book. So I'm not only thinking about whether or not utopianism is useful, I'm also actually trying to write a utopian vision. Yeah.
Like, for example, one example of what I think, which is also in a way not everything, but yeah, you've said something that I would buy and I would agree with. So I really liked, I think it's like the good like point to analyze the need for utopian thinking in a contextual like approach, which is to say the classical utopian thinking was not that necessary. Our utopian thinking from the 21st century is necessary. I like that approach. The thing is, okay, you've conquered that it is today necessary and it was not 150 years ago. Okay. Is it not only, this is my question, necessary, but possible? Is it possible? Okay, we've conquered it is necessary. Is it possible? And what do I mean by possible? I don't mean the second anti-utopian thinking. You said that we are that deep in the world that we cannot think about in utopian terms. It's like, what I mean is it possible to conquer the results of the conditions before conquering the conditions themselves? Do you know what I mean? It's like, is it possible to... We have not conquered the conditions for a revolution or for communism. Is it possible to conquer before that the results of those conditions and the conditions themselves? That's how I think about it. It's like, when I think in utopian terms, I cannot not see that step like onwards without like a consideration of the steps that go before them. I can express it in another way. For example, is it really imagination or utopian thinking something previous to making or organization? Or is it not something that happens while and after organization? You know what I mean? It's like, I think there's a confusion, almost like an order confusion regarding like the steps. And I think that makes probably necessary, but mainly impossible to like jump to the results of the conditions. That's more or less how I think about it. That's how I see it problematic, like to conquer the results before conquering the conditions.
All right. Thank you for that question. I think that's a really good question, and I think I agree with most of what you said, but I do think it is possible. I just think that in a certain way, I think that maybe utopian thinking will become, or the closer we get to a revolutionary situation, the less necessary utopian thinking will become. So I think that's also why this is in a way a pessimistic argument that I'm making, that because we do not seem to be very close to a revolutionary moment, then unfortunately it is actually necessary to keep the belief in the possibility of another world alive by means of utopian thinking, among other things. I think the most powerful way of strengthening that belief is having experiences of actually acting together with other people and changing their lives, also in things, through struggles that might not be, about the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, but for example, rent control in a city or other struggles for improving living conditions under capitalism. I think that's the political practical experience of acting together with other people and changing something is probably the most powerful way of strengthening the belief in the possibility of another world. But utopian thinking can also be a part of that, or can add to that. So, but what I wanted to say is that I think we should just acknowledge that, or I think it is important to remember that when the time comes that a revolution will happen or capitalism will, that some sort of, capitalism, it might be a realistic scenario that capitalism will end, not as a result of a revolution, but in another form of collapse situation. But either way, when that time comes, when capitalism will end, people are gonna, what I'm trying to say is that I think it's relevant to develop utopian visions today, but at the same time be very aware that the utopian visions that we're going to implement when the time comes are not going to be anything like the utopian visions that we develop now. But I think they're still necessary as a tool for practicing that way of thinking and developing as starting points or tools that will become useful in that context. And I think so. Just another way of replying to this question would maybe also be to just say that it is possible because there's a lot of people that are doing it at the moment. I think that there is a kind of renewed interest in utopian thinking, or maybe it's just me that's been very interested in it in recent years and therefore notice it more. But my impression is that there is more utopian thinking. There has been more utopian thinking on the radical left in the last 10 years than there were in the decades before that. Just to give a few examples, I'm thinking of things like Aaron Benanav's work on beyond capitalism and the multi-criterial economy, as he calls it, but also Michelle O'Brien, Iman Abdelhadi's work on, it's a kind of speculative fiction about the New York Commune in 2052 or something like that. And Michelle O'Brien's work on the communization of care. There's also the German group Friends of the Classless Society that wrote this text called The World Commune, which is also a kind of utopian vision. There are lots of other examples. And so that's also a way of replying to the question of whether it's possible or not that it's actually taking place. And what I presented here today could also be understood as a kind of a justification of that tendency, or maybe a kind of meta-level explanation for why does it seem to be more popular today? Why is this becoming more popular?
Esperem que hàgiu gaudit d'aquest episodi. Vos convidem a la nostra 5a escola d'estiu a Xàtiva del 4 al 6 de setembre. Ens veiem en les nostres activitats i en les xarxes socials. Som la Fènix Universitat Popular.